Meccano part number 48A in post-war green. Hi folks and welcome back. This week, as the name might suggest, it's the anti-aircraft gun. This build intrigued me from the off. The idea of a working firing mechanism leads to all sorts of ideas that go through my head. And in my videos, I tend not to talk about my love of Meccano. Unless it's one of the aeroplane constructor builds, and then I probably gush a bit too much. There is something about building something. Taking parts, following a plan, whether it's a written plan or a plan in your head, is not important. It allows you to explore the world and create something that works. And living in the world that we do, that's something that we don't do anymore. And I didn't used to fix things. I used to be, if it's broken, bin it, or pay somebody to fix it. And when I first started dating my yet-to-be wife, her father decided that I needed to learn how to fix my car, instead of sending it to somebody else to be fixed. And for the first time in my life, in my mid-20s, I picked up mechanics tools and started to learn. The first job was fixing an exhaust that was blowing. And the lesson of picking up a hammer and hit it was an interesting one to learn. Don't forget that I've worked around heavy tools all my life up to this point. But for some reason, the idea of taking a hammer and hitting a car was just a no-no. You didn't do that. I'm still very grateful for all that he taught me. He saved me thousands of pounds over the years that I've been fixing my cars. One of my daughter's earliest memories is lying on her back under a car, watching as I tighten the bolts on another exhaust. It is one of the things that has given her lifelong love of mechanics and how things work. She has been offered a job as a trainee mechanic working on buses and is following her dreams. I know her grandfather, dead some 20 years now, will be so proud of her. His toolkit is being reboxed and will be hers. A third generation fixing vehicles with the same tools. And yes, I now have to go out and replace my toolkit. Well, parts of it. But what's not to like about buying new shiny things? Another love I have for Meccano is the tinkering side of it. The getting it all to work as it should. As a child, it just annoyed me. Build it, play with it, throw it in a box, still half made frequently, and then get annoyed when 6 months later I took it out and had to undo the half-finished model that I'd left behind. But I couldn't get this to fire well. It sort of worked, but just not in the way of range. I don't think it was the way to the projectile, more likely time spent on tinkering with the breech to get it to work and operate smoothly, allowing a better transfer of kinetic energy from the spring to the shell. It is a tried and tested method of firing, so I think it would have been something simple that I'd got wrong with the build. But that's the joy of Meccano. There are faults for you to fix and improve on. The anti-aircraft gun is a bit of technology that just seems to have appeared out of nowhere at some point in history. It is, of course, First World War. After all, it's the first conflict in which aircraft were used to bomb other targets. And you'd be wrong on both counts. The anti-aircraft gun predates the First World War, but not by much, with their introduction being 1910. But the first bombing of a civilian population from the air was 1849, when Austria attempted to retake the Austrian city of Venice. Yes, the same Venice that's now in Italy. At the time, it was part of the Austrian Empire, after it was captured by Napoleon in 1797, and then ceded to Austria later that year. In 1848, local Italians, sick of Austrian rule, rose up and took the city. claiming it as a republic. Attempts to retake the city failed, and in 1849 a young Austrian lieutenant came up with the idea of launching UAVs carrying explosives that would fall on Venice. The first attempt on the 12th of July failed. The UAVs were balloons, and as they rose in height they encountered a wind travelling in the opposite direction. Most blew harmlessly out to sea, with a few even falling back on the Austrian Navy, which was in charge of the operation. By the 22nd of August they were ready to try again, this time with more favourable results. 200 balloons were launched, each carrying 33 pounds of explosives, a total of 3.3 tons. Each bomb's fuse was ignited by an electronic signal and was designed to fall to earth and detonate, causing fires. The raid caused little to no damage to the city, but did break the morale of the citizens of Venice, as there was little to no warning of such attacks. The city surrendered 2 days later, as much due to the effects of starvation and disease, the enemies of all sieges, as due to the balloon attacks. By the turn of the 20th century, the effects of bombing by air were fully envisaged, and large calibre field guns were redesigned to allow for vertical shooting. But hitting was as much down to luck as anything else, as there was no way of aiming the gun correctly. It wouldn't be until the 1920s and 1930s that more accurate aiming practices would be invented. Before that, it was a case of putting up a wall of steel fragments, which the enemy aircraft would fly through, but judging height from the ground was a hard skill to master, and it was a simple case for aircraft to gain or lose height, which is difficult to observe from the ground, and by doing so be either above or below the exploding shells. In most cases, during the First World War, Archie, as AA-FAR was called, was used to warn friendly pilots where the enemy was, more than the damage it caused to the enemy. But there was an unforeseen side to bombing of large populated areas. In most cases, it is used in an attempt to break the morale of the people, and in fact, all too often the opposite is the outcome. In the First World War, the German bombing campaign of British cities had little to no effect, but it did cause the redeployment of equipment and 4 fighter squadrons being redeployed from France to the southeast coast to defend the capital. All told, the civilian losses were very low, with only about 1,500 killed. That compared to nearly 61,000 for the Second World War. What the First World War did was to help us prepare for the Second World War. In 1917, the civil defence policy was first created. The need to have easily recognisable shelters was identified, and at once the deep underground tube stations were tabled as the best option. At the peak of the 1917 bombings, nearly 300,000 people sheltered nightly in the stations, with another 500,000 sheltering in basements and cellars around London. But by this point, people had lost their fear of the bombs. In fact, there was a sort of tough spirit, and we will stand together to deal with this, a one for all and all for one feeling that helped people keep it together through the hardest of times. That spirit would rise again in the darkest days of 1940 and 1941, when Britain stood alone against the might of Hitler. We would not be broken. We would not go screaming into the dark of the night, not without a fight, not without the final raise of 2 fingers to the enemy. We would stand. We would survive. Much the same is seen now in Ukraine, as they again face the same problems, an enemy using air power to destroy and drive panic and terror into the populace. And they will emerge afterwards strong, unbroken, undefeated, as a nation, to rebuild as have the ones that have lived through this before. My mother was born in 1932. Her father, a First World War veteran, was an air raid precautions warden who patrolled areas in Walsall in the Midlands, in and around Newhall Street and Caldmore Road. His job to make sure there were no lights showing and deal with making areas safe if there was an unexploded bomb. Not to defuse the bomb, but just make sure nobody went near it. The stories she tells of hearing the sirens start up, one after another, and heading out to the air raid shelter, dug in the sandy soil of the garden, with the smell of the heavy oil recycling plant that was in the industrial property that joined theirs at the bottom of the garden. With the sudden flashes in the sky as anti-aircraft gun batteries opened up, along with the slow droning sound of enemy bombers. Watching out of the crack in the blackout material that formed a barrier to the outside world, she, along with her brother, would watch as the pencil-like beams of white light would scan the blackness of the night sky. Sometimes finding a raider, they would all gather, and the sky would erupt around the aircraft in vivid reds and yellows. My mother-in-law would also tell other stories, like the time when they watched a raid on the city that she lived just outside of, when one night the bombers, after destroyers moored in the docks, came not long after dark. Wave after wave of British Lancasters hunting 2 German destroyers nestled in the port of Lübeck in northern Germany. How the city seemed to burn, lost in the wrath of the RAF. Shortly, for a few brief hours, they had time to help fight the fires that had been caused by the bombing, to then have the American bombers of the 8th Air Force attack. She, just like my mother, could not find peace at night when a turbo-powered prop plane would pass overhead. Listening to her tell her side of the war was a moment of realising how bad it must have been, and just maybe the propaganda post-war had painted a very different picture as to what the other side had suffered. I'm blessed. I live in a country that is at peace. I have never had to listen to the sounds of the air raid warnings, never sat in a shelter in terror of what might be about to happen. My greatest worry is whether I might run out of tea bags and chocolate biscuits. And I pray and hope that that will always be the case.